My guest today is a noted parapsychologist who rocked the scientific community in 1981 and hasn't stopped since. Dr. Rupert Sheldrake has written and co-authored well over a dozen books which propose a theory referred to as the Morphic resonance theory. It's a theory that I'm personally a fan of and have been for quite some time. It provides insight and gravitas to other theories such as Jung's collective unconsciousness theory, quantum field theory, and even evolutionary biology. Dr. Sheldrake has a PhD in biochemistry from Cambridge, a master's degree in natural sciences from Clare College, Cambridge, where he became a fellow working on biochemistry and cell biology, in addition to other fellowships and positions that he's held in psychical research. The list is long and his career is quite distinguished. Dr. Sheldrake, welcome to the conversation.
Good to be with you.
Yeah, I really appreciate you coming by. I first became aware of the morphic resonance theory back through your first book, A New Science of Life. It was in the mid-1980s, and we were doing consciousness and psi research at the Monroe Institute. At the time, we were very keenly interested in trying to figure out the mechanisms behind the information flow which comes to psychics. Most of them were remote viewers, but there were other brands of psychics involved. Your theory, in my opinion, provided the most grounded explanation for what this information flow was. So I've been actually looking forward to this conversation and meeting you for about 30 years. I know a lot of our listeners in the audience are already familiar with the work, but for the benefit of those who are not, let's get them up to speed with some of the basics. Let's start with the first question. What is the premise of the morphic resonance theory?
The premise is that the universe has memory, that the whole of nature has a kind of memory. The lower laws of nature are more like habits. Mm-hmm. Each species has a kind of collective memory, which Jung called the collective unconscious when it's in humans. But I think that every species has that, not just a memory of behavior like animal instincts, mm-hmm. but also of form. I think when a cabbage grows, it's tapping into a collective cabbage memory, right. A memory of form. And the idea of memory in nature is sort of shocking in Western thought because it's never been really part of mainstream Western thought. In Hindu and Buddhist thought, it's been standard and mainstream for well over 2,000 years. Right. What for some people in the West is shocking, it's utterly unshocking in India and in Buddhist cultures. Right. So the idea of memory in nature isn't my idea. Lots of people have had that before, including the American philosopher C.S. Peirce at the beginning of the 20th century. But what's new about my hypothesis is trying to say how it works. Mm-hmm. And what I suggest is there's a kind of resonance between similar self-organizing systems across space and time, independent of distance in time or space, but working from the past. Right. A cumulative memory. So every giraffe embryo, for example, as it develops in its mother's womb, tunes into previous giraffe embryos, and when it's born, tunes into previous giraffes and picks up their instincts, having already picked up their forms. And so this is a kind of collective memory. It's heretical within biology and controversial because many biologists assume that all inheritance is in the genes. Mm. I think genes are grossly overrated. We know what they do. They code for protein structure. But I think the inheritance of form and behavior is largely because of morphic resonance.
Right. Well, my impression and understanding of the theory is multifaceted. That which you're calling memory, I'm referring to as information. Do you think that would be an accurate assessment?
Well, I think slightly misleading because as soon as you mention the word information, many people's minds go to information theory, which is a technical theory of how to send information down telephone wires. Mm-hmm. In bits. Right. And information theory is kind of atomistic and granulated because it's all about bits. Mm-hmm. Morphic resonance is a holistic theory. I think it works through fields, which I call morphic fields, mm-hmm. rather than in granulated atomistic bits. So I prefer to use the word form. In formation, is
Right.
putting form into something.
Right.
And I think it just avoids ambiguity and confusion by saying form, not information, because then you can cut out all the baggage that comes with the word information in the genes, information, technologies, etc., nearly all of which are atomistic. Digital computers work on
Right.
plus, zero, plus type binary things. They're granular, whereas morphic resonance is about holistic patterns of organization. So if you use the word form, I don't think it'll be a problem.
Okay, we'll talk about it in terms of form then, because I like the word information because my mind doesn't go to, the transfer of information necessarily through bits or through vibration, if we're to talk about it in audio terms, but that the information is something that is, how shall I say this? It creates form out of nothing. For instance, the information that you've given me through your book was not previously in my consciousness. It was, blank slate, and you informed my consciousness through your words. So when I talk about information, I'm talking about the transfer of knowledge. I'm talking about the transfer of culture. I'm talking about the transfer of a lot of different things. Transfer of stuff. I don't know what to really call it beyond that.
Well, form would do just as well for all those, actually,
Okay.
because form isn't stuff. Mm-hmm. It's like the architect's plan of a building is form,
right?
But the stuff is the bricks and the mortar and the timber and stuff.
Correct.
That's the stuff. But what gives form is the formative principle. I mean, my hypothesis is officially called the hypothesis of formative causation.
Okay.
So, I mean, the word information is fine in the sense you use it, but the fact is that lots of people don't use it in that sense. And if you use it in any kind of vaguely scientific context, people's minds do go straight to information theory and bits and bytes and rates of transfer and stuff.
Right. And that's basically because their minds have been informed to believe that is the way we should interpret the word information, right?
Exactly, yes.
All right. Well, for the purpose of our conversation and for my lack of better language, I will use the word information in the text that I was referring to. And if it doesn't quite jive with what you're trying to communicate, let me know, and I'll try to find a better word. From my understanding, your theory is kind of multifaceted in that it's implying that this information flow is occurring and it's nonverbal. Okay, it's not written, it's not spoken, it's implied information inherent in what some people would believe to be the genes of a species, but I think there's something more to it, as your book suggests. It also implies that this information is being transmitted to individual entities, as you mentioned, similar entities, quote unquote, similarities, that could be defined as a culture or a family or an entire species. And that this information exchange is not necessarily genetic, as you were speaking before, or a function of intellect. You're saying that this information, quote unquote, extends from a memory source that exists in some field, and perhaps we can call that some form of energy, which is outside of the brains of the individual entity. Is this an accurate encapsulation, do you think?
Yes, I would say that the form, the transfer of the memories occurs by morphic resonance directly from the past. The point of morphic resonance is that it's a relationship across time.
Right.
And sometimes people say, well, where are the memories stored? Well, that for me is the wrong question, because where is a question that requires a spatial answer.
Right.
Then you have to say the Akashic field or the ultimate cosmic field or something like that. Or the cosmic memory banks or the Akashic records or something. All of those imply a spatial storage. Memory is a phenomenon in time, not in space. And I think that there's the whole of the past is potentially present everywhere, and that we access it through resonance on the basis of similarity. So that's how I think it works, basically. And I think that the genes help organisms to make the right proteins, but then they tune in to morphic resonance, like a TV set tunes in to transmissions.
Right.
It's not storing all that information inside it, as a video recorder does, but a TV set or a radio or a smartphone, for that matter, are picking up on a resonance. They work by resonance,
right,
and by invisible resonances coming into them. We're all familiar with the idea of invisible resonant phenomena from the technologies that we use every single day of our lives.
Right.
And I'm suggesting that not only brains and bodies, but also plants, animals, even crystals work like that. If you make a new chemical compound for the first time, it's usually very hard to crystallize.
Right.
And the more often people make it anywhere in the world, the easier it gets everywhere else.
Right.
So I think that's morphic resonance as well. And that's got nothing to do with genes or brains. But it's got a lot to do with form, the form of the crystal.
Right. Well, I'm right there with you. Let's go back in time a bit. Tell the audience how you came upon this theory. What was going on in your life at the time?
I was working on developmental biology at Cambridge University, particularly on plants and plant development. And I was near the forefront of a field working with plant hormones, particularly a plant hormone called auxin, AUXIN, chemically indole acetic acid, closely related to the amino acid tryptophan and tryptamine and 5-hydroxytryptamine or serotonin. It's in that family of compounds. Anyway, I discovered how the auxin was made in the plants. I figured out how it was transported in one direction only, from the shoots towards the roots. And I and my colleagues were far ahead of anyone working on animal development. We knew what the key chemical was, we knew how it moved, etc. And then I realized that actually, although this was all a breakthrough and a triumph and all that, it didn't really explain plant form, because all plants have the same auxin and the same transport system. So a fern, a palm tree, a cabbage, a hollyhock, they've all got the same hormone. And within the same plant, like a hollyhock, the flowers, the fruits, the stem, the leaves, the roots, all have the same hormone. So that can't explain why they are the shape they are. And well, just like all mammals have adrenaline or epinephrine, it doesn't explain their different forms of behavior. It's a key coordinator of their activity. So I then got interested in ideas about morphogenetic fields, form-shaping fields, an idea first proposed in the 1920s in relation to animal, plant, and fungal development. These are fields, invisible fields that shape form, just like magnetic fields within and around a magnet influence the pattern of iron filings if you put them around a magnet. They're inside and around the magnet. And the idea was that organisms have form-shaping fields. Each organism has a field for the whole animal or plant, then fields for the tissues, for the cells, for the organelles. There's a nested hierarchy of these fields. That shape the development. That seemed to make a lot of sense, but nobody could explain how the fields were inherited, because they're not in the genes and couldn't be carried in genes. And at that stage, I read a book by the great French philosopher Henri Bergson, who wrote about memory. And Bergson argued that memories were not stored in brains, but involved a direct transfer across time. There was a new kind of causation that science had left out. Now, that for me was the key clue, because I then realized morphogenetic fields could be inherited by some connection across time on the basis of similarity. And then I was thinking for what word could express this, or what phrase, and morphic resonance seemed to me the best way of conceiving of it. So this arose not by studying Oriental philosophy or esoteric studies or anything. I came to this through Western philosophy and detailed scientific study of plant development. And I later found that this fitted in very well with Eastern thought, with the thought of Jung and people like that.
Right.
That's not how I got there in the first place. All these other similarities became clearer later on.
Well, I want to touch on all of those issues that you brought up. The first thing that comes to my mind is the amount of criticism that you took over the years, as a lot of parapsychologists do, from others who are in the sciences. And frankly, I don't think I've ever spoken to anyone, and I've spoken to a lot of psi researchers and parapsychologists, who is more attacked, quote unquote, by scientism than you. And one of the things I've always admired about you is that you have a wonderful knack to bring that down quite a lot in the debates that I've seen you have. You have an ability to challenge the assumptions of those that are debating with you about what true science is. For instance, your assertions about, like classical physics, for instance, it's the result of an archaic notion about the universe regarding that it's been governed by, quote-unquote, fixed laws, which is based on Plato and Aristotle. So I'm interested to know if you're a fan of chaos theory and implicate order theory. Are there any crossover of these theories with morphic resonance theory?
Well, the implicate order theory of David Bohm is the idea that there's a kind of unseen order underlying the world we experience.
Right.
And he got there through thinking about quantum theory and how it works.
Right.
And he and I had a dialogue about morphic resonance and implicate order. We were quite friendly.
Mm-hmm.
We met through Krishnamurti in the first place, because
Right.
he was very close to Jiddu Krishnamurti. And in my book, A New Science of Life, the third edition of it, the current edition, which in the United States has been retitled Morphic Resonance,
Mm-hmm.
there's a dialogue between me and Bohm on morphic resonance and the implicate order.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, he's saying the implicate order underlies what the world we live in, the explicate order, the folded out order. Implicate means folded in or
Right.
infolded.
Right.
And when he first put this idea forward, I said to him that if it was just the infolded order folding out, then this was very like the Platonic theory of eternal forms that just fold out into the world, but there's no feedback.
Right.
But if there's feedback from the world of nature,
Mm-hmm.
then it would mean the implicate order changes with time and has a kind of inbuilt memory.
Right.
And that memory would show up all over the universe if it's in the implicate order,
Right.
because it's not located at a particular place or time.
Right.
Which Bohm took on board, and he talked in terms of the introjection of what's happened into the implicate order, giving it a kind of memory. And the result is that the predictions of it turn out to be exactly the same as morphic resonance, but it's just cast in terms of a different language, the
Right.
language of quantum physics.
Right.
So there's a very good agreement
Mm-hmm.
there, which Bohm and I both recognized. So morphic resonance has a good agreement. And what was the other one you asked about?
Quantum field theory.
Quantum field theory. Well, quantum field theory is quantum matter fields are the fields that underlie electrons and protons and so on.
Right.
And quantum field theory is really about probability structures in quantum fields which shape what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
I think that morphic fields work in a very similar way. They're probability fields which influence indeterminate events. That's how they work.
Mm-hmm.
And most things in nature are indeterminate. Atoms and their behavior is indeterminate, it's probabilistic. The weather's probabilistic. The behavior of the nervous system is probabilistic.
Right.
Almost everything in nature is probabilistic except man-made machines,
Mm-hmm.
which are designed to be as deterministic as possible.
Right.
And when you're using your computer and you press the letter A to type a letter A, you don't want it to come out with S or T. You want it to be A every single time.
Right.
So we make our machines to be as deterministic and predictable as possible. In that sense, they're a very bad model for the rest of nature. Mechanistic, science uses the machine as the principal metaphor for all reality.
Right.
Whereas machines are a very, very specialized corner of reality, entirely man-made, and extremely unlike the rest of nature, precisely because they're deterministic. So I think that the implicador, the way that machines work, the probability structure, as in quantum field theory, fits very well with morphic resonance. However, quantum field theory is only halfway there, because most scientists and physicists, most physicists and mathematicians are still basically Platonists. They believe that beyond this world, there's an eternal world of mathematical forms.
Mm-hmm.
That they're the only humans privileged to access it through mathematics. That the equations of quantum theory are somehow part of an eternal reality, or at least a reality that came into being with the beginning of the universe, when all the laws were supposed to come into being, like a kind of cosmic Napoleonic code.
Right.
And so they would think that quantum fields are governed by eternal mathematical laws,
mm-hmm.
whereas I would say that they're governed by what's happened before, and that the probabilism is part of their memory.
Mm-hmm.
And any memory system, you see, any system with a collective memory is a kind of average. It's inherently probabilistic. If you took an average of all the people in the world riding bicycles, you'd end up with a kind of morphic field for bicycle riding.
Mm-hmm.
But it would include all the individual deviations that people have from standard techniques, but the most probable would be standard methods of riding bicycles. And when someone starts learning to ride a bicycle, they'd be influenced by morphic resonance from the whole of that probability field. But the most probable would be the standard method of doing it. But it's always a kind of average and probabilistic. So I think they're probabilistic not for just because it's a part of their eternal nature, but precisely because they're a kind of average of what's happened. And if you take an average of anything, you end up with a kind of like a bell curve. You end up with sort of more likely things, and then the edges of the curve, less likely things can happen. Right. I think morphic fields and quantum fields work like that. Mm-hmm. But I think quantum fields work like that because they've got a kind of inherent memory rather than eternal equations governing them.
Well, I'm certainly not qualified to weigh in on the truth of the mathematical structure of the universe. I'm just a recording engineer and artist, but I hear the subtle differences there, and I'm really struck by a couple of things that you've said. One being the memory, which I want to get back to, but I'm very struck by the name that you gave this theory, the morphic resonance. The word morphic implies to me that one shape is moving into another shape. I envision that as a form of evolution, right? One thing moving into another. And the word resonance, being that I am a recording engineer, having to do with sound vibration or a force that's being amplified in a dynamic system, which is contained, like a guitar or, say, a room. It's in resonant with. So why the name morphic resonance to express this, again, information exchange between individual entities? Is it because the entities are in fact similar, which creates that resonance of sympathy?
Yes, it's because they're similar. And the word morphic comes from the Greek word morphe, meaning form. I mean, nowadays, most people think of it as about change of form, like something morphs into another.
Right.
But its real meaning is to do with form, and the science of form is called morphology. Mm-hmm. If you're studying the structure of crystals or the structure of leaves or something, it's called morphology. Mm-hmm. The development of form in biology is called morphogenesis, the coming into being of form. Mm-hmm. Morphogenetic fields are fields concerned with the coming into being of form. Mm-hmm. So morphic resonance is really a resonance of form on the basis of similarity. Mm-hmm. So the reason I use the word morphic is because it is basically all about forms. And you see, just stepping back a little bit, if we look at the big picture about how nature works, in old-style materialism thought that nature was composed of hard stuff, matter, made of atoms like little billiard balls, right, pushed around by forces, mm-hmm, external forces. Right. modern science, post-1920s, through quantum theory, says that even electrons and atoms are vibratory patterns of activity.
Right.
They're not hard, enduring stuff. They're processes, and they're processes of vibration. I mean, this is not some New Age interpretation of science. This is totally mainstream, elementary, undergraduate textbook stuff. This is an electron is a vibratory pattern of activity. So what modern science is telling us is that nature is made up of two basic components that work together. One is energy, which gives things actuality. It underlies movement, change, and matter itself. Matter itself is frozen light, as David Bohm put it, because the energy of an electron can come from light. Right. Light is energy that's free and can move at the speed of light. But if it's trapped in an electron or in an atom, it whizzes round and round in a circle. It's sort of trapped. Right. But it's still a wave, and it's still made of energy. But the energy has its form from a field. An electron field shapes energy into an electron. The electron is a vibratory pattern of activity in an electron field. A proton is vibratory pattern in a proton field. The energy can take any form. It's the field that gives it its form. The energy doesn't give the form. It's like the sunlight falling on your garden. If it falls on the leaf of a rose bush, it becomes part of a rose. Right. If it falls on a dandelion, it becomes part of a dandelion. If it falls on grass, it becomes grass, part of the energy of the grass. Like an electric plug, the energy in the electric plug can power a toaster, a hairdryer, a computer, or a fan. It can do all sorts of different things. It's promiscuous. So energy has no form of itself. Right. The form it has in nature is given by the fields which shape it and within which it's enclosed or contained. And so morphic fields, like all fields, are basically formative in their nature, but they wouldn't have any actuality unless they had energy within them. So there's this distinction between form and energy. Okay. And that's why I like the word morphic, because it's to do with the form side of nature, which is given by fields, morphogenetic fields, quantum fields, gravitational fields, like the shape of the sun as a sphere or an approximate sphere, is because it's shaped by the gravitational field.
So when we're talking about the exchange of information through memory from a past to present in a given species, let's talk about, humans walking upright for the first time. They're changing form. That becomes not part of the genetic memory, quote unquote, but is part of the field memory, which now will inform similar humans to do the same thing on a worldwide basis. It's just an evolutionary leap that occurs through this information exchange of that one change in shape to another, or change in form to another.
Yes. There might also be genetic evolution going along with it. So humans say a few humans start walking upright for one reason or another. Then those that had, stronger bones or, better structured hips, and, the chemistry of the bone was better for the extra strain. If there were genetic mutations that made the whole proteins and the whole chemistry of the body work better, natural selection would favor them as per standard evolutionary theory.
Right.
But standard evolutionary theory wouldn't give you the walking upright in the first place. Right. So there's genes do play some role, but they're not the primary driving force, in my view, of evolutionary innovations. And it's already known from experiments with rats that if rats learn a new trick in one place, then rats elsewhere in the world can learn it quicker. And I think actually there's a perfect way of testing it, staring us in the face through word puzzles. I'm thinking particularly of Wordle, a 5-letter word puzzle. I'm sure you've come across it, Mark. You may not do it, but you must know people who do.
I do.
Yes, well, my wife is a fan, and so I have daily exposure to Wordle.
Right.
Now, I would predict that they have a new puzzle every single day, a new word, and it takes people a given number of trials to get it. You have 5 trials, and you might get it in 2 or 3 or 4, or you don't get it in 5, you flunked. Now, I would predict that the score on Wordle would be worse in the morning than in the evening, because by the evening, so many people have solved the Wordle puzzle, millions of people around the world,
that
it should be getting easier.
Right.
So, by morphic resonance. And I've actually carried out online surveys among Wordle doers to find out whether people do find it easier in the evening. And actually, the majority do. A lot of people only do it in the morning or only do it in the evening. So I have to ask a subsample of people who might do it at different times of day. So the ideal thing is somewhere, the Wordle is now owned by the New York Times. So somewhere in their archives, they've got the scores for every single day and what scores they've got throughout the day. And so the experiment's being replicated on a daily basis. I tried to get hold of these scores from New York Times, but I'm afraid they're terrible spoil sports. And I had talked to the head of the games department, and she said, "We are not interested at this time in pursuing this." I suppose that they know morphic resonance is controversial. New York Times is a fairly conservative paper in terms of science, if they mess with me and it turns out morphic resonance is happening in the New York Times games department, suddenly their quiet lives of just putting out a new puzzle every day would become the center of a scientific firestorm. And I think they're just playing safe.
I don't think
there's any malice.
Right.
I don't think there's any malice. I think people just want a quiet life on the whole.
Right.
But that would be an example of a possible test, and it's frustrating that the data are already there and it's not possible to access them. But sooner or later, it'll be possible to do something like this maybe with other word puzzles. There's a whole lot of them: chordal, dawdle, etc., octawdle, and they're not owned by the New York Times.
Right. Well, I think I'm going to leave that one alone because I believe we could probably go down a pretty deep rabbit hole regarding that. It's probably a good idea here to take a quick break, let the audience stretch its legs, let our sponsor have a word. When we come back, let's pick up on the idea of sympathy.
Expanding on Consciousness is brought to you by the Monroe Institute, a nonprofit organization and leader in consciousness education and research, teaching you how to actively explore and use expanded states of consciousness, providing direct experiences that are deeply personal, uniquely meaningful, and life-changing. Monroe has been helping people create more meaningful and joyful lives through the guided exploration of expanded consciousness for 50 years. Gain the knowledge and understanding you seek to create the life you desire. Learn more about where to start your journey to expanded awareness with Monroe. Visit monroeinstitute.org or check out our Expand Meditation app, available on the App Store or Google Play.
Okay, let's get back to this notion of sympathy and what you're calling similarities. The memory exchange from past to present seems to be species specific. The upright human, through either possibly a genetic pattern, I heard you leave that as a possibility, but through the morphic field memory of one human becoming upright and that transferring over to other humans, and becomes a habit pattern, so to speak. Why the sympathy? Why the similarity in terms of the recipient of that past memory information? Why is it having to do with the sympathetic resonance of some sort between the shape?
Yes, I mean, sympathetic resonance is really another way of just saying resonance.
Right.
I mean, the sympathetic resonance of stretched strings, like if you put your foot down on the sustaining pedal of a piano and you go ooh into the piano,
Right.
it echoes back ooh. And if you say ah on the same note, it'll say ah back to you, because it's a different set of overtones that are resonating with the piano strings. So resonance works on similarity, which is, radio works on, you tune into a particular frequency, the same one that's being broadcast, and then you tune in, and otherwise you don't. So all resonance works on similarity. So really that's a key part of the metaphor. It's sort of built into the metaphor that it depends on similarity. Now, why morphic resonance should occur is another question. I mean, I'm just suggesting that's how nature works. And the point of the experiments on morphic resonance that I and others have done is to show whether or not this really happens. If it does really happen, which I think it does, then another question would be, well, exactly how is the information transferred? David Bohm would say through the implicate order. Other people might say through higher dimensions. I mean, superstring theory, which is mainstream in physics, has 10 dimensions. So it's not as if extra dimensions are, again, some kind of way out new age idea.
This is physics.
They used to be there, but they're now mainstream in physics. And physics has got an embarrassingly large number of extra dimensions now. They come cheap in modern physics. So there's plenty of scope. Some theoretical physicists think that morphic resonance may work through these extra dimensions. Things may be closely linked through these extra dimensions. Now, I can't really evaluate their theories because I can't follow the mathematics, and I'm out of my depth. But basically, I don't care how it works. My main interest in does it work or not, and what are the implications. And, in a sense, there's a parallel with electrical and magnetic fields. When Michael Faraday described electrical and magnetic fields in the 1840s and 50s, he hadn't a clue how they worked. He showed that if you have an electric current, it causes a magnetic field. And he showed that if you have it going, you can have something like a primitive electric motor through electricity and magnetism. And now the whole world's full of electric motors. He didn't know how it worked. And it was only 20 years later that James Clerk Maxwell came along with his Maxwell's equations that explained electromagnetic fields and showed that light is an electromagnetic phenomenon. But he thought that worked through subtle matter, the ether. And then in 1905, Einstein showed that the ether doesn't exist. You've just got a field. It isn't made of anything. It's just the field itself is what's involved. And then in quantum electrodynamics, you've got all sorts of theories about virtual photons and stuff. The theories of just regular electrical and magnetic phenomena have changed over time, but the phenomena have gone on happening and are the basis of all our technologies. And superstring theorists would like to explain them in terms of their 10 dimensions, but it's not going to affect the way your computer works or mine, or how your smartphone works. I mean, they're going to work anyway, even if they decide it's not working through straightforward concepts like we used to have, but it's through these extra dimensions. So it's like that with morphic resonance. If it happens, I dare say there could be a wide range of possible theories as to how, and those might come and go. But the interesting thing is the phenomenon itself.
It's true. I mean, you and I could probably spend hours talking about sympathetic resonance, mysticism, the effect of sound on consciousness. But I know your time is very limited, and I want to stay very focused on your theory. I do know that you also have an interest in Eastern philosophy, which, according to the research I did prior to the interview, you did not have, and I heard you say it earlier, before you came up with this series. So that is true. Did your research lead you to look into the esoteric knowledge of the East and mysticism in general? And if so, what did you manage to discover there?
Well, I in 1968, before I came up with morphic resonance, I did travel through India, and I lived in Malaysia for a year. I was working on tropical rainforest ferns at the University of Malaya, where I was in the botany department. So I had been exposed to Eastern thought, but I hadn't sort of really assimilated much of it. I was aware of it.
Right.
And after that exposure to India, I got interested I have to admit, I got interested in psychedelics. And I took LSD around 1970, 71.
Right.
And that, for me, opened up a whole range of conscious experiences, which I'd never suspected before.
Right.
And led to a conscious interest in consciousness and the nature of consciousness, which I hadn't thought about much. And then, because I wanted to explore consciousness without drugs, I have nothing against drugs, but I didn't want to be taking psychedelics all the time.
Right.
I started, I learned about transcendental meditation, and that's where my previous exposure to India and Buddhist culture in Sri Lanka played a part. And I realized here's a whole tradition of exploring consciousness from within. So I took up transcendental meditation around 1971, and that gave me an interest in Hindu philosophy and in yoga. And then so interested did I become that in 1974, I took a job in India, and I lived in India for 7 years. But morphic resonance happened before that. It happened around 1973. I came up with morphic resonance. So I was already doing meditation. I had traveled in India, but I hadn't really studied Hindu philosophy at that stage. And my focus was very, very much on plant form. That's what I've spent my days thinking about. And as I say, the idea of memory in nature, I hadn't really assimilated the idea of karma and memory in nature from India, but that came to me from Bergson, and really is from a Western philosophical source. I then realized there were these overlaps and connections.
Quite a few, right?
Yeah.
Right. So now that you have had this experience or these experiences and taken consciousness into your equations, do you think that the field through which morphic resonance is occurring is consciousness itself? And if so, how do you personally define consciousness at this point?
But I don't think it's consciousness itself, because morphic resonance is mainly about habits, and habits are unconscious. I don't think that the morphic fields are inherently conscious. I mean, I don't think the field governing the crystallization of salt, for example, which I think of as a morphic field, has to be conscious. It's doing something very habitual. And if you and I are driving a car and we're on a familiar route, we don't have to spend our time thinking, do I press the accelerator at this point? Or some, you can go on having a conversation about something else, and all this comes automatically through habit.
Right.
So I think most of our behavior, like that of most animals, and indeed most of nature, is habitual. I think where we need consciousness is not to carry out regular habits, which morphic resonance helps explain very well, but to choose among possible courses of action that are possibilities where things can't be shaped by habit. Like if you're on a habitual route to work or something, you don't stop at every junction and think, do I turn right or left here? You just do it. If you're in an unfamiliar place and you haven't got Waze or some other navigation system, you're doing it from a map or something, or written instructions, you stop at a crossroad, you look up which way to go. If you can't find out from a source, then you try and figure out from the sun's position where's east or west, and you have to make conscious choices. And that's where consciousness comes in. It's about making choices. So my own view of consciousness, shaped, I have to say, by the philosophy of the great philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, is that consciousness is about choosing among possible actions. And we're conscious of things where we need to make choices. What do I say next? Where do I go next? What am I going to do tomorrow? How shall I get from A to B? We're conscious of all that. What shall I say to so-and-so? Or why didn't I say that? And why can't I might say that instead, sort of thing. It's all about possibilities. The default mode network, our ruminations, we're all about possibilities. Our minds are full of possibilities. whereas most of our life is going on automatic by morphic resonance. So I think that consciousness is not just a matter of habit. It's like floating on the world of habit given by morphic resonance. It enables us to make choices about new decisions. We can decide that we're going to take a new job, for example. And if we take that new job, that's a conscious decision. We go through the various options, we make a choice, we take the job. But by the time you've been in the job for a few months or years, then large aspects of the job are routine and habitual, and you don't have to think about them anymore, and new habits build up and stuff. But the initial choice is made in consciousness. So I think that insofar as consciousness exists throughout the natural world, we would expect to see it come into play when there's a choice involved. When a bee enters a garden in the summer and there is sort of 50 different kinds of flowers, if it's used to going to blue flowers of a particular species, it may just go to those just out of habit. But each individual bee has to do it for the first time. It has to go to gardens and explore flowers. And I dare say there's a kind of conscious awareness of the different flowers and the shapes and the smells. And then it has to choose which one to land on and collect pollen from. So I would say that involves consciousness. But the sort of, once it's in the flower, the sort of routine of collecting the pollen and stuff, sticking out its tongue and sucking the nectar, all that may happen instinctively and in a routine way. So I think animals and even plants may have consciousness when they need to make decisions among possibilities.
So you see consciousness as awareness and cognition and decision points and agency and volition. Those are words that you would find synonymous with the word consciousness?
Yes, more or less. Although a lot of cognition might happen automatically. If I walk into a room and I see a chair, I know it's a chair, but I don't have to think, is that a chair? I instantly know it's a chair. So a lot of cognition is habitual. You see, the point is that, as everyone agrees, this isn't an original point at all. Most of our mental activity is unconscious, as Freud and Jung showed, that our mind is more than our conscious mind. It involves a large part of it, which is unconscious. And one of the points of psychotherapy and things is that lots of people's habits are unconscious and the reasons for the habits are unconscious. And you can't change them unless you bring them to consciousness, unless you recognize that this is a habit. And sometimes unless you actually see why you built that habit up in the first place as a child or whenever it came into being. So that's why I would say the mind is more than consciousness, because a lot of it's unconscious. And morphic resonance is part of mental activity, but again, it's not all conscious.
Well, I remember one researcher defining consciousness as, I'm going to paraphrase this here, a compendium of cortical stimulation through some sensory awareness and memory cortex recall. So this all implies brain functioning as being consciousness. But your theory speaks of memory as being outside of the brain. So how do you think about those two in comparison? That one model being, consciousness being defined as in the brain through that process, versus the Eastern model of consciousness being a sea in which we swim?
Well, I think that memory, I don't think our memories are stored in our brains. I mean, this is the lesson I learned from Bergson right at the beginning of this whole epic journey. That I think the brain's more like a tuning device than a storing system, more like a TV than a video recorder. So I think our memories happen by morphic resonance from our own pasts, and we're more similar to ourselves in the past than to anyone else, which is why we get our own memories. But we're also similar to lots of other people, which is why we get a collective memory as well, as a kind of background, what Jung called the collective unconscious. So I don't think memories are stored in the brain. Now, materialists, I mean, science is dominated by the philosophy of materialism, which is what I discuss in my book, The Science Delusion, called Science Set Free in the US. Although the new edition, only published in Britain, is now available on Amazon in the US, The Science Delusion New Edition. I have a chapter there called Are Memories Stored in Brains, where I go into all this in some detail.
Right.
So I don't think that memories are stored in brains, and I don't think minds are just what brains do. The standard materialist view is that minds are what brains do.
Sure.
The mind is produced by the activity of the brain inside the head, and it's all inside your head. It's produced by brain activity, and it's nothing more than brain activity.
Right.
And that's why materialists are driven crazy by parapsychological phenomena like telepathy or the sense of being stared at, because if the mind's all in the brain, my thoughts shouldn't be able to influence you or anyone else thousands of miles away. And yet there's very good evidence for telephone telepathy, people knowing who's calling when they're thousands of miles away. That ought not to happen. So for materialists, like the person you quoted, then they simply can't handle that. They get angry and they deny that these things are possible. They say these things are totally impossible. They're unscientific. They're worse than unscientific. They're pseudoscientific.
Right.
Anyone who does research on them is a pseudoscientist. That's why my Wikipedia entry, which is dominated, Wikipedia has been captured by dogmatic materialists. The entry on me says two things about me in the very first sentence, because they know Google will propagate that every time anyone searches for me. First, that I'm a pseudoscientist, and secondly, that I'm a parapsychologist.
Right.
Now, I call myself a biologist. I've worked on animals, on plants, and biology. The reason they want me to be called a parapsychologist is because look up parapsychology in Wikipedia, and it's defined as a pseudoscience. So by calling me as parapsychologist, they identify me as a pseudoscientist in their eyes. Now, for most people, there's nothing wrong with being a parapsychologist, but although I do research on telepathy, I don't call myself a parapsychologist because most of my research is on regular biology. Anyway,
it just happened to fall into that realm simply because its implications were metaphysical. It fits
in with morphic resonance, you see, because if organisms are part of a social group, there's a kind of morphic field for a family, or for a flock of birds, or for a school of fish, or for a termite colony. The field is more than the individual animals. They're part of a larger field. And this field continues to link them even when they're apart, which is why telepathy typically happens between people or animals that are closely bonded. Telephone telepathy, where you think of someone who then calls, or just know who it is before you look at the caller ID or pick up the phone, typically happens between family members, best friends, lovers, therapists and clients, people who've got emotional bonds. It doesn't happen with random insurance salesmen or cold callers or strangers.
That's what caller ID is for.
Yes.
Right.
And and the same with dogs. I wrote a book called Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home, about telepathy between dogs and their owners. Also cats and horses and parrots, and the book's all about these various powers of animals. But there again, most dogs do it with only one person, and some do it with two, but they don't do it with hundreds of different people. So it's to do with the morphic field. And because I was interested in, I predicted something like telepathy should happen on the basis of morphic fields. And lo and behold, it does seem to happen. And that's what got me interested in this. Not because I'm particularly psychic myself. I've only got sort of average psychic abilities. Not because I was totally fascinated with this whole field for years and years and years. It's because it made sense to me. And also, it's an area where there's very few people researching because it's very taboo, because of these materialist taboos. And I personally like working in very under-researched areas of science because there's much more chance of making new discoveries if you're exploring new territory than if you're working in a very crowded area of science where every tiny detail is being picked over by hundreds of people.
Not to mention there's not a lot added to the collective memory lying in the field that could be informing the work that you're trying to do, right? It gives you, you have to step into the unknown.
Yes.
Yeah, well, I don't have to tell you how difficult it is to create a well-designed psi experiment, and we all know that there's dogma of scientism is a hurdle to the advancement of psi research in general. But you do encourage people to do their own research. You've actually written a book called 7 Experiments That Could Change the World, which teaches people how to apply the morphic resonance theory in their own lives. Explain to the audience quickly some of the experiments that they can conduct for themselves if they were to pick up this among your many other books.
One of them is on the sense of being stared at. 95% of people, according to surveys, have had the experience of finding they turn around to find someone looking at them, or they look at somebody from behind and that person turns and looks back.
Right.
Now, this is very common. I've done lots of experiments on it, which are randomized trials where people are looked or not looked at in randomized sequences. And the results show this is a real phenomenon. It even works through CCTV. At the moment, I'm developing an app which people can use on their smartphones to do sense of being stared at experiments
wonderful.
with their friend.
Right.
And what I'm hoping with that is that people don't have to have the app, but the app makes it much easier. It's not been launched yet, but we hope to have a beta version fairly soon. And what that will do is enable people to practice. I think most people aren't very good at this. They're sort of amateurs.
Right.
If you do martial arts, you can be trained, get better at it.
Sure.
But most people, you could train yourself, and the app is designed to make it easier for people to train themselves and become better at it. Then experiments with dogs and cats. About 50% of dog owners and about 30% of cat owners have animals that know when a member of the family is coming home. Here's a perfect opportunity for research. I even did a children's book on this called Boy's Best Friend, showing how 10 or 11-year-olds could do this research for school projects.
Right.
And so if anyone's got a dog or cat that knows when they're coming home, then it's easy to rig up a webcam or some system or surveillance system that monitors when the cat goes to the door or the window.
Right.
And people can record when they're setting off home on their phone, do a selfie saying, I'm setting off home now.
Right.
So you can have graphic record with the timing.
Right.
You can have the film of the cat going to the window or door and waiting there. And then when mounted on a split screen, you can have very good evidence for this phenomenon. Now, that's using available technology, which most people have. And as a matter of fact, no one has yet done a filmed experiment with cats. So here's a chance for original research with cat owners that anyone could do. It's fascinating, can involve the kids. It costs almost nothing. Another project is with mothers and babies. Many mothers know when their baby needs them and starts crying, especially when they're breastfeeding. And many nursing mothers go back to work after a month or two. And many have had the experience of their milk lets down, their breast starts squeezing out milk for no apparent reason. They're sitting at an office desk. And most mothers, when that happens, just say, my baby needs me. And they used to go home. They don't anymore. They phone home on the mobile phone to say, and they find they're usually right. Now, here's another perfect opportunity. A lot of people have video baby monitors. You leave the video baby monitor running and record the output, which would give an exact measure of when the baby wakes or starts crying when the mother's away. The mother, when she feels the milk let down, could do a selfie on her cell phone and have an exact record of when she feels that. And again, with the split screen thing, you could actually see how these match up.
Yes,
anyone who did that, no one's done it yet, but because universities won't touch this research with a barge pole because it's too controversial.
And they'll take the data and throw it in file 86 anyway.
Yes, and most mothers don't do it because they're just so exhausted.
Right.
But if they have a partner who's not quite so exhausted, who could set this up, then this could very easily be done. And if someone did this experiment and and put a YouTube video with the mother sort of saying, my milk's letting down now, and on the other side, the baby waking up in its crib and crying, it would go viral on YouTube.
Easily.
No one's done it in the entire world. So what's frustrating about this research is not that it's difficult or complicated, or that you need a grant, or that you need to get the research approved by endless committees,
right,
which you do in most fields of science.
Right.
Anyone could just do this. So what I try to do is encourage people to do this. Most people don't do it because they've been thoroughly disempowered to think that you can only do science if you've got a job and a grant and a PhD and stuff.
Right.
But actually, lots and lots of people could be playing a constructive role in a really creative kind of citizen science.
Absolutely. And not only that, it would contribute to the memory and probably make us all a lot more psychic as time goes on, or at least come to a conclusion of how to make it easier for someone to become psychic and to become apparent habit pattern that could be adapted by the next generation. I'm
going to have to go in a moment, so I'm sorry, Mark. But
not at all. I was just about to call that to your attention. We've hit the 61-minute mark. Should I wrap up the interview now?
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, the last question that I want to ask you is, do you think that human consciousness will one day reach a point in its evolution where this phenomenon will have an effect on our ability to self-actualize, to become happier, to reach that top of the pyramid that we all seem to be trying to climb towards?
Well, yes, I think we've already reached that point. My two most recent books are about science and spiritual practices. One is called Science and Spiritual Practices, and the second is called Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work. And both of them really are about how we can all do spiritual practices, whether we're religious or not. I mean, the best known is meditation, but singing and chanting, for example, which occur in all religious traditions, but which you can do anyway. You don't necessarily have to go to church to sing. You can join a community choir, or you can do it with a family at home.
Right.
Singing and chanting have a morphic resonance component, because when you chant, especially if you chant some traditional chant, your body resonates as you chant. Different parts of the body literally vibrate. If you're doing it with other people, you're chanting, taking breaths at the same time. You're all coming into a kind of resonant sympathy with each other, synchrony.
Right.
And if it's say a traditional mantric chant, or a traditional chant, in any tradition we have these. I mean, there's many chants in Hinduism, in Islam, in Christianity, like Kyrie eleison, which has been used in liturgies for 2,000 years.
Sure.
If you're chanting one of these very traditional chants, then you come into morphic resonance with all those who've done it before,
right.
And you're connected across time.
Right.
So I think these things are already happening. I think they're going on before our very eyes. They're hiding in plain sight. And what I do in my books is try and show how anyone who's interested could take up these practices. There's 7 different practices in each book, and there's a kind of guide on how to do it. So that's something anyone who wants to take it further could do. And so anyone who's interested in further information can find all my books are described on my website, sheldrake.org. Anyone who, I've got a YouTube channel too, with lots of things on it, Rupert Sheldrake on YouTube. It's just search for me on Google and you'll get that. And I also have a newsletter, which on the website, there's a sign up thing. 3 or 4 times a year, I send a short email newsletter with updates on my various activities. So, for example,
Fantastic.
When I launch the app for the sense of being stared at, I'll put that out on my newsletter and on my website.
Well, I'll look forward to actually getting that app. I'm just finding out about it now because I'm not a member of the newsletter and the website, but that'll change. Dr. Sheldrake, I think we could talk about all sorts of things for days and days and hours, but I really want to thank you first for being among the first people to bring this idea into Western thought and science. And as I said, New Science of Life, was a pivotal book in my thinking. It informed my personal sense of the mystery of consciousness, and it prompted me to learn it, to use it in different ways and perhaps more wisely. So thank you for that. And also thank you for displaying the courage and wisdom to present this theory to all of us, as I said earlier, and we can both talk about that for an hour regarding the scientism and the flack that you've had to take as a result of your willingness to go down this rabbit hole. So I thank you for that, and I hope that you'll enjoy this again when you have the time. I'd really like to pursue this.
Well, really, we covered a lot of ground, and people, if they want more, can go to the website. Yes. And so on.
Well, I wanted to make sure that I represented your work well, and that we
covered
you
did, and in a well-informed way. Thank you for doing that.
The pleasure was all mine.
Well, thank you. A pleasure talking with you.
Be certain to tune in again to Expanding on Consciousness to become informed on the fascinating field of consciousness studies and its applications. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the guests and the host. They do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Monroe Institute. Expanding on Consciousness is underwritten and produced by the Monroe Institute, copyright 2023, and is broadcast by permission. Reproduction or redistribution without the express written consent of Monroe Institute is prohibited by law. For more information about Expanding on Consciousness, visit our website at monroeinstitute.org or connect with us on the socials. Thank you for listening.